Let's talk about repairs in the due diligence, paragraph 8 of the state contract, how they're interplay. One thing we know that the buyer can do is inspect the property. Then we know the buyer can ask for the seller to make certain repairs. Then what they can ask for is absolutely unlimited. The buyer can ask for anything to be repaired, and the seller has to repair absolutely nothing. So that the buyer can ask away, but it doesn't mean that the seller would be required to make those repairs. So that's the interplay we have here. Now, of course, if the seller does not agree to make any repairs, then the buyer can walk away by paying the termination fee. So that would be whether or not how serious the seller is about selling to this particular buyer or under the conditions of this contract. Now, I see two options. Certainly, it's very simple under the current documents. If the buyer says, if the seller makes these repairs, all of the repairs that I've requested, then I'm ready to close. If so, the Form 525 in its current condition with no modifications serves sufficiently. However, if the buyer, for whatever reason, may still want to terminate, should the seller agree to make all of the repairs requested, the buyer has an issue with the 525 as it's written. Just tell you to be aware that paragraph 2 of the 525 repair addendum says modification of contract. It specifically says that if the buyer and seller were to agree on this repair addendum to the contract, the buyer waives any due diligence right to terminate the contract. So the buyer must be very aware that once the 525 is presented and agreed upon by the parties, the buyer can no longer terminate under due diligence. Some people think that's good. Some people think it's bad. The 525 also has in it an expiration date that of course should be before the end of the due diligence period, because the buyer would need to have time to evaluate and say, well, if the seller's not going to make these repairs, do I still want to go forward? So the buyer would need to hear from the seller before the end of the due diligence period. However, the other thing that may happen is the seller just says nothing. If the seller says nothing, I think the buyer should take that as a no and proceed accordingly. Okay, now it's very important. The repairs have to be agreed upon during the due diligence period. They do not have to be completed during the due diligence period. However, the 525 addendum must be completed and fully agreed upon by both the buyer and the seller in the due diligence period. However, all the repairs do not need to be made during that time period.